will have the main message today by Mr. Matthew Steele entitled Forgiveness.
Hello again. I'm going to get better at the scheduling thing. I keep double booking myself. I'm always looking, I was telling Ben earlier, I look on the screen when I'm using the software to schedule things, and I'm making sure nobody else is double booked. I just forget about myself. So, I don't know if anybody has noticed in the last 18 months or so, there's been an election running. Anybody paid any attention to that? Probably not. Man, I mean, it just seems like every election cycle, it gets more and more bruising, doesn't it? And just worse and more, don't go on social media during elections. Well, maybe just don't go on social media, because there's nothing social about it. I think maybe anti-social media would be a better term. But I was thinking about the election and just how people treat one another. Because in the end, right, these are people, right? There are parties made up of people championing their particular candidate, and it's people saying things and doing things and presenting things about the other parties and people. It's human interaction, isn't it? And it's awful. I'm sorry, but it's on both sides. It's just awful, isn't it? And it got me thinking, after the election, a passage came into my mind, and it is a beautiful passage, and you all probably know it better than I do. But I remember reading it for the first time in Washington, D.C., at the Lincoln Memorial. And there on the wall is carved Lincoln's inaugural address. And then I'm trying to remember, I know the first one was there, but the second one, I think it was there too, where I read this for the first time. He said, with malice toward none, with charity, which is that old English word for love, with love for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace amongst ourselves and with all nations. Just beautiful words, isn't it? And he said that on his second inaugural address at the very end, the very last passage. And of course, he didn't get to see any of that happen. Because, unfortunately, those conspirators that took his life didn't agree with that philosophy of trying to bind up those wounds. And we think our election campaigns are divisive, but a civil war. You know, and that's one of the things you often hear people talking about, how politics is becoming so much more divided and we're going to end up in a civil war. And I don't think people truly understand what that it really means. Otherwise, I don't think we would use that term so lightly. But it got me thinking about this fundamental thing that we are called to do. Because after all of this, electioneering is over, and whoever's won is won, and whatever outcome happens, what should happen after all that disagreement and that argument and the lying and the campaigning and everything else? What should happen? Forgiveness, right? But do I sound ridiculous for even mentioning it in the context of political campaigns and in government? I mean, it might sound ridiculous, the idea that that could possibly happen. You know, that we're going to see each of the presidential candidates meet up somewhere and hug and forgive one another? I think some of us are kind of not imagining that could ever happen. And yet, we are called to forgive. It is a calling that God has made on not just us who believe, but on all of humanity. It's the central thing of everything, right? Forgiveness. That we can and we should, and it is an expectation that we should forgive one another. And so, I thought I would talk about forgiveness. Such an easy topic, and I know you are all experts at it, right? In fact, you're so good at relationships, you never need to forgive or be forgiven, right? If only that were true. We know that we cause conflict. We know that we hurt one another. We know that we need forgiving and that we need to forgive. So if you would, just set aside maybe a little bit of fear and anxiety about this idea, and let's just explore the importance of forgiveness. There's an exchange, an interesting exchange, and I think you know where I'm going to go, between Peter and Jesus in Matthew 18, verse 21. Clearly there's a backstory, right? Because Peter's coming up to Jesus with this question. He says, Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive it? Up to, let's say, 7 times? Is 7 times enough? And Jesus said to him, I do not say to you up to 7 times, but up to 70 times 7. We've heard this passage before, right? But just take a minute to think about what must have been going on. Because was everything okay in the world with Peter and his heart and with everyone else that he brought this forward? Who thinks about having to forgive somebody or be forgiven when everything's great? We don't. So clearly there was something going on. And then there's a couple other things we can look at. So, firstly, Jesus is not saying that we need to get a logbook with 490 forgiveness check marks for every person. Because that's 70 times 7. I had to get my calculator out and do that. I mean, it's ridiculous, right? He's not saying, okay, keep a track, you can forgive up to 490 times. But the 491st time, they are out of luck. Who would be okay with that being applied to each one of us? No. I probably run through that in a year, maybe in 6 months. Just ask my wife, right? The idea is ridiculous, but it's an idiom, isn't it? It's a phrase, and he's making a point. It's kind of like, I don't know, we say, oh, if we're dropping everything in a particular day, right? Everything we touch, we drop. I'm like, man, I'm batting 1,000 today. We don't mean we're batting 1,000, do we? We don't mean we're actually playing, I think it's from baseball, right? Or is it cricket? I don't know. Maybe it should be from cricket. So he's clearly making a point. And because every single one of us would use 490 forgiveness points very quickly. But then we can think about that in regards to God, right? Because this is God telling us how many times we should forgive one another. So how many times does God forgive us? 490? Or does it mean every time? Because, of course, 70 times 7 is the use of the biblical number 7, meaning completeness. When God created the earth and he rested on the 7th day, all of it was complete. It was done. It was finished. So, implying that we should forgive until everything that we need to forgive is complete. Think about that for a minute. And is that how God sees forgiveness towards us as well? So, we don't want God to have a limit with us. And we don't want anyone else to have a limit with us, do we, really? And yet, do we find ourselves with some of the same heart issues that Peter had? All right? How many times do I have to forgive this person for doing this thing? Could be the same thing over and over again. And Jesus says, well, as often as they need forgiving. I really think we think about this. I don't think we think about this enough. And I think in some ways we might actually sometimes think that God is like this. That there's a point where we'll do enough bad things that he'll finally just be done with it. Have you ever felt like that? Yeah. I think we probably all have. But Jesus didn't say that. He said the opposite of that. What is it we find in Psalm 103? And I thought this goes really well with the Bible study earlier. In Psalm 103, verse 11, for as the heavens are high above the earth, so great is his mercy toward those who fear him. As far as the east is from the west, so far has he removed our transgressions from us. As a father pities his children, so the Lord pities those who fear him. For he knows our frame, and he remembers that we are dust. He knows how weak we are. He knows that we're just a bunch of dust squished together for a while. And then at some point, all of that comes apart. And we return to the dust. And in between, there is weakness, there is fear, there is abandonment, there is loss, there is pain, and broken relationships. Now, somebody might say, well, okay, yeah, this is true, what we've just read here, but that was a one-time thing. And after we've been forgiven, we need to walk perfectly, not make any more mistakes. Good luck on that. So how often does God forgive us? In Psalm 107, verse 1, it says, oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, and his mercy endures forever. How often does he forgive us? As often as we need it. All the time. Now, is that a license to go run off and do things to just test God and see how much forgiving he's really willing to do? Of course not. Because then that wouldn't be fearing him. Remember the previous psalm, it says, fear him. If we have respect for him, love for him as our Father. So we're not sinning. We're not doing things that need forgiveness on purpose. We're trying to walk this newness of life, and we make mistakes. We are still dust. So the truth of the matter is, when Jesus said 70 times 7, he was using a figure of speech. So, why did Jesus answer Peter this way? I mean, he could have said something like, forgive every time. He could have. He could have made it a little bit clearer. Or he said, well, Peter, there's really no limit. Or, Peter, who's wronged you? What's going on? What's the problem? Why did he answer this way? Because he knew the heart of Peter. He knew where the motivation was coming from. He knew what he was struggling with. And he knows our hearts. He knows how we hold on to hurts when we're wronged. When someone has done something to hurt us. And it's really interesting about the human heart. And I think you'd probably agree with this. I mean, raise your hand if you rush to forgive. Yeah. My son Joseph is claiming that he rushes to forgive. But I've seen and heard him yell at his brother, so I'm not sure about that. Most of the time. We want to. Of course we want to. But it's hard to rush to forgive. What is actually our natural first and oftentimes persistent response? Say that again? Revenge. Or even not revenge, hold a grudge. Or just not forgive. Right? And there's many different ways in which we might manifest that. But our hearts are this way. My heart is this way. I have a problem with forgiving those that have deeply hurt me. I do. I try. I might act as though I have. I might try and be the good Christian that I'm supposed to be and forgive. But you might not really be in the inner circle anymore. That's not good. And that's something that God has made very clear to me. I need to work on. Perhaps you're similar. We don't rush to forgiveness. No matter how hard we try, in the end, we could act like it. We could try and pretend. We could try and be a good Christian. But our actions, in the end, they betray us. How we speak to one another betrays us. Forgiveness is not easy. It is hard. And it will be evident to all if we can't forgive. It really will. It comes out. It comes out. So in Hebrews chapter 12, I believe it was the Apostle Paul, and he gives us this admonition, and it's difficult. It's hard. He says, pursue peace with all people and holiness. Okay, well that's easy. He's giving us an easy list, isn't it? Pursue peace with everybody, so never have any arguments, and be holy at the whole time. Paul liked to set, stretch goals, right? Without which no one will see the Lord. Uh-oh. No one will see the Lord? Looking carefully lest anyone fall short of the grace of God. Lest any root of bitterness springing up cause trouble, and by this many become defiled. Lest there be any fornicator or profane person like Esau, who for one morsel of food sold his birthright. For you know that afterwards, when he wanted to inherit the blessing, he was rejected, and there was found no place for repentance, though he sought it diligently with tears. There is a lot in this passage here about forgiveness, and things that you might not have connected. I didn't. When I started to look at this topic in the light of this scripture, there's some challenges here for us. There's a danger, firstly, that we'll fall short of the grace of God. Does that hit your ears as strange? It hit mine when I looked at it this way, because wait, grace isn't something we earn, right? We've all sinned. We've all fallen short of the glory of God. How can we fall short of His grace? His grace comes to us. He covers us with His grace, with His forgiveness. What is really going on in this passage? Ephesians chapter 2, verse 8. Again, for by grace you've been saved through faith, and not of yourselves. It's the gift of God, and not of works, lest anyone should boast. So what does the writer of Hebrews mean that we can fall short of the grace of God? Well, I think we may read it here in verse 10. He says, "For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God has prepared beforehand that we should walk in them." So, good works. Can it be that we are given grace so that we can give grace? Are we called through our own forgiveness so that we can forgive one another and those in the world and in our family? Anyone that wrongs us. Is it the grace that we fall short of? Is not actually the grace that God gives us in the sense of his mercy over us, but it's the expectation of the level of grace that we should give to others. And do you know what the standard of that grace is? It's God's, his grace. The level in which he has given us grace and given us forgiveness, he is expecting us to show to one another. Not an easy ask, is it? Not by a long shot. We have to meet this mark. We are made, we are designed, we are expected to meet the same level of grace, forgiveness that God has given to us. We don't have a limited number of times or a limited number of cases or a limit level in which we can decide to forgive. He expects us to forgive in the same way that he does and to the same level. Unlimited grace. And there's something else in here. If we're unwilling to forgive one another, then God cannot allow us to continue in his grace. That's what we just read in Hebrews. It tells us that the lack of forgiveness leads to bitterness and is the equivalent, remember what he says, of fornication and profanity. He's tying the actions of Esau into this idea of forgiveness and grace and therefore bitterness. Remember what he said, "Pursue peace with all people and holiness, without which no one will see the Lord, looking carefully lest anyone fall short of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness springing up cause trouble." And that word trouble means suffering. Essentially, it means suffering. And that many become defiled, lest there be any fornicator or profane person like Esau, who for one morsel of food sold his birthright. So you realize what he's saying. I mean, Esau, in the story, you remember, he begged for the food, and so the transaction was with his brother Jacob was, okay, well, I'll give you this food, but you give me your birthright. And he considered his birthright of such low value. Think about that. An entire birthright. What's our birthright? The grace of God on our lives. The forgiveness that he's given us. And we're willing to give all of that up to harbor bitterness and lack of forgiveness towards somebody else. That is a challenge that God has given us. Serious stuff. Being unforgiving leads to a root. It's almost described, I almost see it like an organism, right, that grows within us. A root of bitterness growing up inside of us. A spiritual organism. It causes trouble. It causes suffering. So let me ask you, who is the most afflicted person when we do not forgive? It's ourselves, isn't it? You know, sometimes people have wronged me and they have no idea. And I will hold that in my heart. And they are happy as clams. And I'm the one that looks at them and feels the bitterness and the pain. Why do we do these things to ourselves? Because we're not willing to forgive. Why are we not willing to forgive? Well, there's a lot in there. There's pain. There's embarrassment. There's feelings of being devalued. There's all these emotional things that are attached to this past wrongs and hurts that have been triggered by this new thing, right? There are all these connections, and we are desperately trying to not feel the pain. And for some reason, we think that holding it against someone else helps us not feel the pain. How do I know this? Because I've done it. I've done it. I've felt it. I've refused to forgive. So, just to tell you a story, my first job after moving to Tulsa, after moving to the United States, and it took a while to get that job, and I was very frustrated about not having that job. When God finally gave me this job, which He did, and we have an amazing story about that. You can ask Renee about it. I'm in this new job, and I'm so excited, and it's going to be great, and there's all kinds of opportunities. And the first week in that new job, I meet my nemesis. He had horns and a tail. Might as well have, because I don't know why, but he started undermining my job. He started sending off emails within the IT team about things that I missed. I'm like, my first week on the job. What? What is wrong with this guy? And there was a lot of backstory, but we were building a whole new help desk team in the IT department, and they hadn't had one, and I was trying to ramp up and understand their environment and trying to respond to people's requests for help, and it was very difficult. And I was all by myself. I was the help desk team. And this guy is trying to undermine me and get me fired on week one. Well, you know what that did, right? I rushed out and I hugged him and I forgave him. No. I had a heart of bitterness that grew from that day for years. And anytime he did something, he did it because of this reason and that reason and this reason. And oftentimes he did. He was devious. He lied. He was deceptive. He was, one of those people you don't want to work with. He did have those character flaws, for sure. But how much worse did I make it? Because I couldn't get past the hurt or the attack or the wrong that he did to me. Trying to get rid of my job on week one, I need this job to eat. We need to pay bills, right? I just didn't understand it, and I was like, these Americans are crazy. We never would do anything like this in England, right, Mark? No, in England, we're much more in your face about it. We'll let you know we don't like you. So a root of bitterness grew, and it grew, and it grew. And it got worse. Not because of what was growing in my heart, but maybe my attitude and my manner and and the words I would say. I wouldn't lie about the guy, but I would make sure everybody knew what a jerk I thought he was. Right? And I know none of you have done that about any colleagues that you've ever worked with. But we try and justify, right? We're trying to justify why we feel this way and why this person should be boiled in oil. And so eventually we came to a day, years into the process, 2 or 3 years maybe, and I had built this help desk department. Poor Glenda got hired to work with me. She's got plenty of stories that you're not allowed to hear. And everything was going in the right direction. We had a team, we were growing, we were doing great work, and they decided we're going to reorganize the IT department. And after months and months of haggling and arguing behind the scenes with the senior leadership, he was given my job, and I had to report to him. He was promoted to a manager. I had done all this work as a supervisor, trying to get the manager promotion. He got the job. And I felt great about it. Right? No. Kicked it into overdrive, man. I mean, the unforgiveness. I didn't exactly really want him to be boiled in oil, but I wanted God to come and defend me and bring justice. And what in the world? He wronged me deeply, lied about me. There's a lot. And I didn't forgive him until I did. Until I heard a message like this one in this building. And I think it was given by Lawrence Gregory on forgiveness. And I thought, well, I guess I'm going to have to go do that now. And so I thought about it and struggled with it and thought about it and struggled with it. And then I decided, okay, I'm going to pray for him. And I'm going to pray blessings on him. And I'm going to pray success in this new role for him. And I'm going to forgive him. And I prayed that prayer. And I'm telling you, all the bitterness and all the anger, all of it fell off me in that moment, in that prayer. It went away. Now, I'm not saying that that has happened every single time. It hasn't, because I've had to learn this lesson over and over again. It's something I have to work on. But it did that moment, and it made an impression. And the next time I had a similar situation, I prayed that prayer again. And it happened. The bitterness, the roots shriveled up, they went away. So, I forgave him. And then, opportunities arose. Opportunities came into my life, and I moved on from that company and went on to better things. And that of itself is interesting, because God will not allow us to skip out on these things, right? He will not just let us, well, just move on, and I'll keep that root of bitterness, and every time I think about that guy, imagine him screaming and yelling and boiling oil. Wouldn't hurt him any. He has no idea that I had those thoughts, right? Or harbored that bitterness. The only person it was hurting was me. Was I wronged? Yes. Was there injustice? Absolutely. Welcome to the world. But if I continue in that, then I am changed, aren't I? And I am broken. And I'm made less of a person than God has called me to be. So, for us today, is there someone present, far away, dead, or alive that we are harboring unforgiveness towards? Do you have a root of bitterness like the one that I just described? Do you have a root of bitterness in your heart? Justified with actual real things that happened. Yes. Do we have that? Do we have that unforgiveness? Are we willing to pray those prayers of forgiveness? Are we willing to pray a blessing on our enemies? what is it doing to your character if you have that? To your relationships, to your health, to your eternal salvation? Are we willing to hold on to this unforgiveness, this bitterness? Just going to hold on to this one piece in exchange for my salvation. Because that's what we just read is at stake. And we can dig into that a little bit more. Because you remember what Jesus said to Peter after he asked the question. Because it wasn't just 70 times 7. He added a whole parable to emphasize the point. In Matthew 18, verse 23, he says, "Therefore the kingdom of heaven is like a certain king who went to settle accounts with his servants. And when he had begun to settle accounts, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. But as he was not able to pay, his master commanded that he be sold, with his wife and his children and all that he had, and payment to be made. The servant therefore fell down before him, saying, Master, have patience with me, and I will pay you all. And then the master of the servant was moved with compassion, released him, and forgave him the debt. But that servant went out and found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii, much, much less. And he laid hands on him and took him by the throat, strangling the guy. Pay me what you owe. And so his fellow servant fell down at his feet and begged him, saying, Have patience with me, and I will pay you all. And he would not, but went and threw him into prison till he should pay the debt. I never understood the logic of a debtor's prison. How do you pay the debt exactly when you're in prison? So when his fellow servants saw what had been done, they were very grieved. And that there is something to think about how our unforgiveness to one another, what do others see in that? Are they grieved as well? And they came and told their master all that had been done. And then his master, after he had called him, said to him, You wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt because you begged me. And you could not also have compassion on your fellow servant, just as I had pity on you. There's that falling short of the grace mechanism. You see that? He was falling short of the grace that was shown to him. And his master was angry and delivered him to the torturers. That sounds pleasant. Some thumb screws, maybe the rack. Can't imagine. Sure, there were torturers. I know there were in medieval England, so they were probably very familiar with this when they were translating this into English. The torturers, until he could pay all that was due to him. So my heavenly Father also will do to you if each of you from his heart does not forgive his brother his trespasses. Oh boy. It's there. And we want God to forgive us and be gracious and generous to us all the time. And he's saying, I am, as long as you are too. He is expecting us to be just as forgiving. The parable kind of speaks for itself, doesn't it? And this is part of the answer that Jesus was giving to Peter. He's very clear. Anyone that does not from his or her heart forgive a brother or sister, and he means it, a deep felt from the heart forgiveness. A forgiveness in spite of the actual wrongs done, in spite of the real damage done. Nobody's denying any of that. From the center of that place where a root of bitterness will grow up, he's asking us to forgive and be like him. Until we pay, I guess the alternative, right, is to pay all that we owe to our master ourselves, which is ridiculous because we can't, right? We needed to be bought with a price. Christ's own blood bought us with a price. We can't pay anything back. And so he's expecting us to be as gracious as he is. We have to forgive all the lies, all the cheating, stealing, all the sin, all the actions. We have to forgive as he forgives. We can't pay our debt. In the story I told you earlier, I think I mentioned it, I wasn't released from that situation, from that work situation, until I had prayed that prayer of forgiveness for my enemy, for my nemesis. And after I did, then I was released from the torturer. Because it all just went away. It just went away. And then opportunities came along. As I mentioned, I left the company and moved on. This is what God expects us to do. He wants us to be like him. We're made in his image. We're made to give out his grace like he's given to us. I wish I could remember that in every moment, you know. Oh, I'm mad at them. They've done this wrong. I'm justified. God's grace. Wish I could get my brain to just run over there and remind me of the grace that God has for me. But that's why we're all stuck together. Can he allow someone to be eternal in his kingdom who is not capable of the kind of forgiveness that he is and that he expects of us? He can't allow that. He cannot allow that. Eternal suffering would continue. And we don't want suffering. Right? We read that passage in Revelation. There will be no more suffering. No sorrow, no pain. The former things are gone away. And this is one of the things. Being unforgiving. That will be gone away. I have to learn to forgive others that trespass me. It's in the prayer. Right? The prayer that the disciples asked, Lord, teach us to pray. Forgive us our debts as we forgive those that trespass against us. There's a process that he has put in place here. We need to forgive like he forgives. There's another thing that happens when we do this. And it's, I think, it was Ken maybe that mentioned in the Bible study, or maybe Renee. I get the two mixed up sometimes. Not really. But I think one of you said, looking up. Renee, I think you said that. Right? We look down at our problems. We look down at our hurts. We look down at the things that have been done to us. I do it, and I don't look up to God and get his perspective and ask, why is this guy doing this to me on the first day of the first week that I'm employed at this place? What's going on? I have not been here long enough to have wronged him. Truly hadn't had any interaction with him. I was like looking at emails and asking people, who is this guy? I didn't ask any of those questions. I didn't ask, what's going on? Why is he acting like this? It wasn't until I left the company and learned a while later from a mutual friend, oh, he wanted the job that you got hired for. And there was a whole backstory and how dismissed he felt. And he'd been there for years, and he should have had that job. And whether he should have or not, that's how he felt. There was a story behind his actions. Man, if I had known, 24-year-old me is trying to figure out the world. You're a kid, right? I chose the wrong path, made him a nemesis. If only I had known, I could have looked up from my own trouble and asked the question, why are they doing that? What happened to them? Right? What happened to them? In counseling circles, I think I've talked about this before, we talk about hurt people hurt people. We know that, don't we? Hurt people hurt other people out of their own woundedness, out of the wrongs and the trespasses and the disagreements, all the things that they've received in life. Real things that really happened, not just imagined, not slights that were blown out of proportion, but real things. And out of that hurt, we just share the hurt. And God is calling us to be different and to live in a different way. Let us not give up the grace that God has given us for a plate of bitter roots like Esau. Let's not do that. But instead, try our best, forgiving one another along the way as we make mistakes. As Paul says in Romans chapter 12 and verse 9. He says, let love be without hypocrisy. Don't pretend. We don't have to be hypocritical and deceptive. Hey, you hurt me. You did this, and that upset me. And let's have a conversation about it. In love. We can share the things that we do to one another, and we can forgive one another. He says, abhor what is evil. Cling to what is good. Be kindly affectionate one to another with brotherly love in honoring, giving preference to one another. Not lagging in diligence, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord, rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation, continuing steadfast in prayer, distributing to the needs of the saints, given to hospitality. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice, and weep with those who weep. I just want to point out that line. Bless those who persecute you, and bless and do not curse. Why is Paul saying not to curse? Do curses work? Do they work? Lots of people curse in the world, right? I don't think it's talking about curse words. I think it's about actually cursing people. Putting the damnation on them. The enemy gets into those things. And if we are not careful in our heart, that root of bitterness can spring up and we can curse someone. And the enemy can use it against us and against them. Paul says, do not curse one another. Rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. Be of the same mind toward one another. Do not set your mind on high things, but associate with the humble. Do not be wise in your own opinion. Repay no one evil for evil. Have regard for good things in the sight of all men. If it is possible, as much as depends on you, so the whole part that depends on you, live peaceably with all men. There's a part that depends on others. God's not asking us to do our part and somebody else's part. We can't do that. But he is asking us to do our part. And it's uncomfortable when someone else doesn't do theirs. But God says, oh well, you do your part. I have to do my part. Beloved, Do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath, for it is written, Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. Therefore, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him a drink. For in doing so, you will heap coals of fire on his head, not boiling oil. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. I know this has been a heavy message, but this is what we're called to do. To share the forgiveness of God that He has forgiven us with. Let's not fall short of the grace of God.